So can you explain some of Scotus's more controversial positions having to do with the will?
Yeah. So the term here that gets used is called voluntarism, and it's a hard technical term to define because it gets used in a lot of different ways. But probably in the most broad sense, we could say that a thinker is a voluntarist if he or she has a special emphasis on the role of the will in whatever aspect of philosophy they're talking about. And I know that's quite vague, but Scotus is a voluntarist, at least in that sense. In a more specific way, he sometimes gets characterized as a voluntarist because he thought that the intellect, the human intellect, can never compel the will to will anything. You think, well, what's significant about that? Well, if you are um, a medieval theologian and you think that our final end as human beings is the beatific vision, which is some sort of union with God, uh, if our intellect never compels the will to will anything, then here's the limit case. You could be in the presence of God. God could be present to your intellect in a way that makes it impossible for you to think of another option that would be a better option for you at that moment. You know, God is just so in your face, so to speak, that you can't help but judge that knowing and loving God is the best thing for you to do. That's what the intellect, so to speak, hands down to the will. Like, look, you found your final end. In that limit case, someone like Aquinas would say, the will has no options at that point. Like the intellect has found the unalloyed perfect good. So the will simply follows the intellect, is compelled to do so. I mean, of course, it's not kicking and screaming, right? It's found its beloved. And so its act of willing God is at that point compulsory. Now, Scotus had a view of the will on which, strictly speaking, even in the case of the beatific vision, the will is still free. Now, he thought that God gives us a special grace so that, in fact, we do choose God, and uh, God preserves us from falling away from that perfect act of willing and loving God. But we don't need to go into those details because they are somewhat technical, but that strictly speaking, the will itself remains free either to will for or against God, even in that moment of beatific vision when God is as perfectly presented to our intellects as God can be. Okay, so then that kind of starts sounding crazy. Like, why would anyone think that the will remains free to reject God, even when God has graced the intellect with this perfect vision of who and what God is, the infinite good? And that seems to open up this rift, this disconnect between the human will and what Aristotle long ago taught was the natural object of the will, namely the good. Right? So Scotus has to theorize, like, if he's going to emphasize human freedom so heavily, how will he theorize this connection between the good and the will? And he has a lot to say about this, but one of the things that comes out in the book is his distinction between two fundamental drives or orientations of the will. The affection, the affectio commodi, the affection for what is advantageous to oneself, and the affectio justitiae, the affection for what is just or right in itself. And Scotus thinks that the moral life and the spiritual life are in part a kind of interplay between these two affections. On the one hand, we ought to love God for God's sake, and not just because of all the good things that God gives us. But if we're only, so to speak, willing in relation to our affection for what is advantageous to us, we'll never come to see God as lovable for his own sake. And so that's where Scotus will say, by the affection for justice, we really can recognize that God ought to be loved for his own sake, independent of all of the blessings that he gives to us, and even independent of the fact that our ultimate human happiness is contingent on loving union with God. And that might sound like a severe sort of spiritual teaching, like too rigorous for real humans. And yet, Scotus is a good Catholic, and so recognizes that God really loves us, and theorizes God's love for human beings as having this final end in a loving union with God. So he's able to recognize that, well, part of what it would mean to love God for God's own sake is to want what God wants us to want. And God wants us to be happy, and he wants us to want to be happy, and to seek to live virtuous and holy lives, in part because it's good for us to do so. So in the end, what might seem like a tension between, loving things for their own sake in accordance with their objective value, and loving things for the sake of what they bring me personally, this tension is resolved, at least in the case of God, insofar as by learning to love God for his own sake, we come to want what he wants. And part of what he wants is for us to be happy. And so then we can begin to understand how someone might even will their own happiness out of love for God.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so that two wills theory, it is controversial. A Thomist will certainly not come anywhere close to using that language. But what I think we might think of as the common ground, so to speak, or even if they're not ultimately fully reconcilable on this point, is that both the Thomist and the Scotist will recognize that the fully upright life, the fully flourishing human life, will, so to speak, transcend itself in its willing. That, even from a Thomistic perspective, where human action has only one fundamental orientation, the good itself, that like achieving that good will involve getting outside of oneself. It's sort of built into human nature that in pursuing friendship, or in pursuing justice, or in seeking a loving union with God, we aren't merely looking after our own self-interest, that we really are reaching outside of ourselves to consider the good of other people, the good of God himself, and so on. So even if the Thomist will theorize that religious and ethical phenomenon with respect to just one drive of the will, and so might think of Scotus's distinction here as otios, there is that actual phenomenon that both the Thomist and the Scotist is, so to speak, getting onto. And so I think that's probably the most sympathetic way for the Thomist to appreciate what Scotus is trying to do, even if in the end the whole two wills thing he just can't go along with.
Let me ask two questions about this then. So firstly, would Scotus still say that we're never choosing evil as such? We're choosing evil under the appearance of good? Because either way, we're choosing either our own advantage or God.
Yeah. Do you have to find some good in it? You have to recognize some sort of benefit to oneself. And so...
so he's still saying the will is oriented towards good, if not the good.
Yeah.
He's not like he's not like a total voluntarist in that sense.
Yeah, what we might think of as the extreme or total voluntarist would be that like the will could just as easily have a roll of toilet paper as its final end, as it has God as its final end. You just
Uh-huh.
the Aristotelian line is we aren't free with respect to ends, we're only free with respect to means. And Aquinas follows that. Someone like Occam completely rejects that. Like, we choose the end just as much as we choose the means.
Mm-hmm.
Someone like Scotus represents, kind of a trying to have it both ways a little bit, not completely divorcing the will from its natural end, but also opening up this space for a genuine multiplicity of ends. As it turns out, one and the same thing is both that which is objectively the best thing and that which is most conducive to my own flourishing. And Scotus recognizes that, and maybe that's why he wasn't too concerned about dividing up the will in this way. But yeah, later voluntarists would take this a much different direction and completely detach the will from any naturally given end. And then we have the sort of situation that Pope Benedict XVI warned us about in the Regensburg address. And unfortunately, in my opinion, he associated Scotus with this bad tradition. But Pope Benedict XVI was concerned about voluntarism for precisely this reason. It divorces the will from rationality. Like, if you divorce willing from the good, then willing, so to speak, is unmoored, and then could just literally will anything. And so human life becomes at best just utter chaos. There's no kind of order or meaning to it. And so we don't want that. I think that Scotus is very far from that kind of extreme voluntarism.
My other question about this is, you mentioned a person seeing the beatific vision and being able to choose something else. Does this mean that Scotus has to come up with a different explanation for why, once we're in heaven or hell, we're not going to change our decision?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the short answer is that for the blessed in heaven, God gives them a special grace, the grace of firmness of will, firmitas. Mm-hmm. And it's the theory goes like this. On the one hand, Scotus is really committed to this idea that what it is to be the will is to be free, and so able to choose between options. And it's that for that very reason he thinks that the will in heaven still has this freedom, because the will doesn't change its nature when it gets to heaven. So he holds on to that, but then recognizes that one of the necessary conditions for perfect beatitude is not just that we persevere in continuing to will love God perfectly, but that we are free from the anxiety or fear that we might eventually fail. Imagine, if you know that you could stop willing rightly in heaven, you're like, well, I'm really happy now, but what if in a million years something goes wrong? That might spoil your blessedness right now. So it's a sort of formal condition on perfect blessedness that you have that confidence, serenity of mind, that you will go on loving God as you ought to. And so that is the ground, so to speak, of this grace of firmitas given to the will, so that in fact it won't go astray by the grace of God. And we know that we won't go astray because we know that God has so graced us. So yeah, he has to theorize the permanence of beatific vision in a slightly different way from the Thomist.